Hey guys, I'm your host Tara A. Devlin, and welcome to another episode of Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. I hope you've all been staying safe and well. To hopefully take your mind off things for a while, this week we're looking at two rather popular creepypastas from Japan that involve mysterious creatures hidden deep in the mountains. First up is a creature known as Futa Monel. A young man recounts the time he went to visit some relatives in the countryside as a child and encountered something that, literally, should not be seen. But can he and his cousin be saved? Find out in Futa Monel. This will be rather long. I'll never forget it. It happened during the summer vacation of my 3rd grade at elementary school. One night, as Obon was approaching, my father said to my mother, "I'm gonna take him for a few days." My mother then prepared a bag with several days' worth of clothes for me. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Tomorrow the two of us are going to stay at a relative's house," he said. "We'll be staying there for 2 or 3 days. "Oh, okay." I'd never stayed anywhere overnight before, so I was excited. The next morning, we set out for my father's family home. It was pretty far away, and there had been no opportunities to take me back after I was born. The sun was already setting by the time we arrived. Rice fields spread out all around us, surrounded by mountains. The area almost seemed to be shaped like a mortar, cut off from the rest of the world. There were almost no outside lights, so when night fell, it was pitch black. We greeted everyone, and then after dinner, I was so tired that I fell asleep. The next morning, I made friends with a distant relative who had also come to visit, a boy who was 2 years older than me, by the name of Shin-kun. The two of us decided to go for a walk outside. My grandparents told us not to go too far and also not to go up the mountains. "Why can't we go up there?" I asked. "You don't know the way, so you'll get lost and then you'll never come back," my grandfather said. "During Obon, all our ancestors return to the mountains, so we have to prepare for them at home and wait. That's why you can't go up there," my grandmother said. We chased each other outside and then ate some watermelon the locals gave us while playing in the river. It was really fun, and before we knew it, it was almost evening. "You want to go back now?" Shin-kun asked. I pointed to the mountains. "What's that? There's something shining over there," I said. "Wow, there is." "All right, let's go check it out," Shin said, grabbing some binoculars out of his backpack. "Wow, so cool. I want some," I said, jealous. "Right?" Shin said. I pestered my dad until he bought them for me. I love the movie Goonies, so I've got all sorts of goodies in my bag ready for adventure. Having said that, he peered at the shining light in the distance. It's too far to see anything. What do you reckon? Want to go a bit closer?" Grandpa and Grandma said we shouldn't," I replied, scared. "It's already dark and our ancestors might be returning. Let's go home, quickly." It's fine. Don't worry. It's just a superstition," Shin-kun replied. "We'll just go a bit closer so I can see what it is with the binoculars, and then we'll go home. We won't go that far in, so you don't need to worry." We started walking. I wanted to go home, but I didn't know the way back by myself, so I followed Shin-kun. The sun was just about ready to disappear as we entered the mountain. We found a shrine gate, and from there started climbing. At first, we heard crows and cicadas crying, but before long, the mountain fell silent. "Shin-kun, let's go back," I said, scared. "Just a little further." The sun was already gone. Shin-kun looked through his binoculars again, and then screamed, "There it is!" "What do you see? Let me look," I said, filled with curiosity. "Hang on. What's that? Looks like the wind is whipping up a tornado. No, it can't be. Something is spinning around. A person? No, a person couldn't be that color. Oh, I can't focus. Just a little closer," Shin-kun said, and took a few more steps before stopping. "Are you okay?" I asked after he fell silent. I approached him, and he trembled while blood poured out of his nose. Run! I can't move," Shin-kun said, the binoculars dropping from his face. His face. His lips twisted as though numbed with paralysis. His eyes twitched as though convulsing violently over and over. His whole face seemed to be paralyzed. He cried, and drool trickled out of his mouth. He couldn't close it. He looked like an entirely different person. The fear of how dangerous this situation was, and the reality of what was in front of my eyes mixed in my head, and I took off, blindly running in a dream. By the time I realized it, I had passed through the shrine gate and reached the road. I tripped and hit the ground, rolling. Blood poured from my scraped knee, and as a passing local called out to me, I burst into tears. "What's wrong, boy?" the woman asked me. Shin-kun is up in the mountain and..." I burst into tears again from both fear and sadness. The woman's face instantly turned pale, and she picked me up. "Where are you from?" she said. I told her my last name, and she put me in her small truck and drove me back to my grandparents' house. As soon as we got there, the woman went running to the front door. "This is bad," she screamed. Everyone came running to the entrance when they heard her. "Are you okay? What's wrong?" my father asked as soon as he saw me, his face going pale as well. "Shin! Where's Shin?" Shin-kun's father screamed. "You fools! The mountain!" my grandfather screamed. "Oh my God!" My grandmother burst into tears herself. "You boys get ready. We're going up the mountain," my grandfather continued. My grandfather, father, Shin-kun's father, and myself were to go. Everything around us was pitch black, so they carried with them a pine torchlight. "Listen, once we go up the mountain, until we get Shin back, nobody is to say a word. Understand?" my grandfather said to us. "And no matter what you hear, do not turn around. If it closes the distance between us, it's all over. Got it?" Indescribable fear washed over me. I tried to push it away, and we went back to the same place where I'd left Shin-kun. He was still standing in the exact same spot, in the exact same position. We approached him silently, and in contrast to before, his eyes were now rolled back in his head, showing only the whites, and his hair had turned completely white. The adults picked him up, and I grabbed his binoculars that were lying on the ground. We then started heading back down the mountain. Almost immediately, we heard a low, emotionless voice coming from behind us. "Hey. Hey." I froze in fear, so my father grabbed my hand and pulled me along. It's pointless," the voice continued, echoing throughout the mountain. I did my best not to cry, and then I heard footsteps all around us that weren't coming from any of us. I did my best to keep my senses, and we jumped in the car once we reached the bottom of the mountain. Yet, it wouldn't start. Leave it, my grandfather said, and we hurried back on foot. Shin-kun's mother was waiting at the front door when we got back, and when she saw him, she fell to the ground in tears. I dropped to all fours myself and apologized to them. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I said, over and over while crying. This is no time to be doing that, my grandfather said. It is still coming this way. There's still something I need to do. Grandma, look after them for me. Holding Shin-kun, my grandfather took off once more. My father and Shin-kun's father changed into white clothes that my grandmother had prepared. Then they stripped me naked in the garden and repeatedly poured water over my head from the well. Are you okay? My grandmother asked me when we returned to the living room, her face worried. What's going to happen to Shin-kun? What's going to happen to both of us? What's the thing that Grandpa was talking about? I asked. It was something that had lived in the mountains since long ago. They called it Futa Monel. It wasn't of this world. Nobody had broken the laws of the mountain for several decades, so nobody had seen it. My grandmother thought that it was just a silly old fairy tale. But it was real, and Shin had seen it. And if the legends were true, I was in trouble as well. As we were talking, my father and Shin-kun's father entered and said that preparations were ready. Then my father and I went into a room on the second floor. The entire room was covered in charms. When we went in, Shin-kun's father handed me the binoculars and said, Shin's a curious boy, so he no doubt dragged you up there with him. It's unfortunate it came to this, and I can't forgive him for what he's done. But you're not the one who's at fault here. When my father and I went in, they turned off the lights, so it was pitch black. And then, my father turned to me. We're going to check now whether this really is the work of Futa Monel. If it's as the legends say, then he should be heading this way now. Futa Monel can see far and wide. You have to be careful not to be seen. You know what'll happen if he does notice you, right? That's why you need to look at it from a blind spot. You must look down on it from a higher, further spot than it. But you mustn't speak. If you find it, silently hand me the binoculars. When he said to look for it quietly, he meant in the gap between the curtain, looking towards the mountain with the binoculars. I sat there for an hour in silence, until finally I spotted a vague, strange light in the distance. But it was dark and far away, so I couldn't really tell. Another 2 hours passed. By that point, the thing glowing and disappearing in the mountains had gotten considerably closer to the village. Finally, I saw it. Just like Shin-kun had said, it looked like a person spinning around and around, like a tornado. Not only that, but there were 2 of them joined together to make a single shape. From head to the torso, it was like 2 people without lower bodies. Try to imagine that one of them was like they were doing a handstand. Above that, the other torso sat, like they were glued together. The lower half, the part that looked like it was doing a handstand, acted as the legs as it moved. It stopped every few seconds. The face on the top half looked forward, while the face on the bottom half looked the other way. I looked at its eyes when it stopped. They were pure white. Without looking closely, you wouldn't notice, but They were also moving all around, back, forth, and diagonally, independent of each other. That must have been how it was searching. That was what gave it such a large field of vision. Its hair at the front was short and straight, while at the back it was long. Its skin was pale and covered in spots, like black bruises from internal bleeding. Suddenly a jolt ran through me, like I'd just eaten a mountain of wasabi. I looked up and my father was standing there. He'd slapped my face numerous times to get my attention. At first, I hadn't felt it, but slowly the pain in my cheeks rose, and it was then that I came back to my senses. I later heard that there was a sound, like rain leaking on the tatami mats, so my father hid to see what it was. That sound was apparently coming from my direction, so he tapped my shoulder several times, but there was no response. He tried to turn me to face him, but my body remained rigid, and I was unconscious, blood dripping from my nose to the tatami below. I quietly handed him the binoculars and pointed outside. Apparently, even people who have no ability to see the supernatural can see it if the being is strong enough. After my father confirmed it was outside, the two of us left the room. "No doubt about it," he said to everyone as we reached the first floor. There was no doubt that the thing was coming to the house to drag me back to the mountains. Then my grandfather returned, with several people in tow. They had gathered to move both myself and my father to a safe place. We explained to my grandfather about the path Futa Monel was taking. He confirmed an escape route, and we noticed several cars parked outside, ready for us. I got in one of the cars and a black bag had been prepared. I crawled into it, and although it was tight, they told me it was best to bear it. Then they placed me on the floor in the back seat to hide me before setting off. Inside the bag was pitch black, so I couldn't see a thing. But as we were driving, I heard somebody scream in terror. After that, I heard something banging on the car itself, over and over. When the sound stopped, I heard a soft voice. "Looks like it's gone to check the other cars now." After driving for a short while, we finally stopped in front of a temple and got out. At some point, I'd apparently fallen asleep inside the bag. It was still dark outside, no doubt late at night. My grandfather, father, and myself went into the temple, and I did my best not to fall asleep again. And the monk read prayers for me for 2 hours and 40 minutes. After that, I spoke to my grandparents on the phone, but until I came of age, I was strictly forbidden to ever go back. Shinkun's father quit his job and they moved away as well. His parents underwent religious training for 5 years before they were finally able to help him as well. They sent us a photo of Shinkun and the rest of the family looking happy. Looking at him, his hair pure white, you could see just how terrified he must have been. This next story features a young man and his dog who go camping alone in the mountains of Ishikawa Prefecture. They have the entire place to themselves, but that night they hear a strange noise outside their tent. After going to investigate, they find something unbelievable and almost indescribable. Find out what in Shi Shi Naka. This story takes place at a campground in Ishikawa Prefecture. I just spent the night camping there with my dog. It's a pretty famous camping ground in our hometown, but the manager told us there was nobody there other than us when he came to collect the money, perhaps because it had rained so heavily the night before. There was a concrete fire pit there, kinda shaped like a U, and I somehow managed to get a fire going to make dinner. When you go camping, you gotta have curry, so I made curry and rice with the outdoor cooking utensils. I also gave my dog the dog food I'd brought along. I put onions in the curry so I couldn't give him any, but I did give him some of the steak pieces from it instead. I'm 18 right now, turning 19 this year, and for a variety of reasons, I'm currently waiting for my chance to enter university again next year. Most of my friends are in university already, so none of them could come. I went alone with my dog. He's a German Shepherd, by the way, and his name is Roots. Rain started to fall heavily, so I retired to the tent with Roots early. It was a 3-man tent, so it was more than enough for the both of us. An LED light in the shape of a lantern hung from the roof, making the inside rather bright. The manager told me there might be bears around when I reserved the spot, so I brought my gas gun from home that I used during survival games, but I left it in the case and I didn't even think about using it. I read books while patting Roots, and then around 10 p.m, I reached out to turn the lights off and go to sleep, when I heard what sounded like a cat outside. It wasn't a meow like a cat. It was more like a mating call, or the screams of a newborn kitten. I think most people have heard something like that before. It was just like that. At first, I thought it was a kitten too. There are all sorts of street cats near my house. I don't know if they're anyone's pets, but there are lots of them, and it sounded just like they do when it's mating season. But then I started to think that it would be a little weird for there to be cats out in the mountains like that. I was a Boy Scout when I was younger, and we camped all over the place, and to be honest, I never once saw a cat in the mountains. Plus, cats have this image of hanging around residential areas, or places with a lot of food. But maybe there was a stray kitten out there, so I stepped outside with Roots to check, just in case. I'd set up the tent on the largest tent site, but a short distance from that was a larger space for groups and campfires, and it was from that area that the crying seemed to be coming from. There were of course no outside lights, so the area was pitch black. I grabbed another light I'd brought with me, aside from the LED one hanging in the tent, and headed towards the open area. On the way, Roots suddenly started barking. He didn't usually bark a lot. Rather, he was the type of dog that would happily let strangers pat him. He so rarely barked that it honestly surprised me. My eyes gradually adjusted to the darkness, and as they did, I looked over the area as much as I could. Patches of wild grass grew here and there, and it looked somewhat like a school oval. Then, right in the middle of it, something strange stood in the middle, where the campfires were supposed to be. It was about the size of a sleeping bag meant for winter, and it looked like a massive, hairless caterpillar. At first, I thought it was a bear cub, but at this time of year, the only animals around in the mountains were deer, so I had no idea what it could have been. But there was no doubt about it. Some strange baby was there, crying. It was no longer raining, but the ground was still wet, and there were puddles all over. I was scared, but I was also curious about what that thing was, so I approached it. It flopped around like a jumping fish. Every time it did, it sounded like water splashing loudly. Roots continued barking, but he approached the thing with me. We were about 5 meters away when I clearly saw what it was. It looked like a winter sleeping bag covered in hair. It might be better to say it was sharp, like a porcupine, rather than covered in hair. And it wasn't a bug so much as an animal. I only saw the back of it, and Then suddenly, it turned around. I froze, like I'd been struck by paralysis. There were eyeballs sticking out on what appeared to be its face, somewhat like a slug or a snail. There were 3 of them, and there was a single hole in each. Hair grew beneath what looked like the face, and it might sound odd to say that our eyes met, but it felt like it was looking at me. It was only for a second or 2, but it felt like much longer, and all sound faded away. Roots was barking the entire time, and yet I heard nothing. Right as I thought things were about to get dangerous, Roots bit my shoe and started dragging me backwards, which broke the spell that had frozen me on the spot. I ran back to the tent with him. We somehow safely made it back, but I could still hear whatever sounded like a baby crying. Panicking, I grabbed the gas gun I bought and readied myself. Roots sat by the entrance of the tent, quiet, perhaps trying not to alert me to where the sound was coming from. Honestly, I didn't think the gas gun would make much difference, but I still felt better with a weapon in hand. I had my nutter with me as well, so I was as ready as I would ever be. I stood there at the ready for about 10 minutes, and then suddenly, the crying stopped. I was covered in sweat, and I knew that the lack of crying meant the thing was gone. I considered calling the manager on my cell phone to come over and check. He apparently lived somewhere around the general information area, and he did say to call him if I needed to. I decided to give him a call. I had reception and more than enough battery power, and yet he didn't pick up. It was still before 11 p.m, so he should have been awake, but he wasn't answering the phone. I called over and over, but still no response. Honestly, I panicked. Then I realized that Roots had been at the ready by the tent entrance the entire time. The crying had stopped, so maybe he just hadn't let his guard down yet, I thought. But then my entire body broke out in goosebumps. It was the first time in my life I'd ever felt like that. I heard something crawling across the wet weeds. No doubt about it, it was coming towards the tent. I should have extinguished the lantern, but even though I had Roots with me, I couldn't stand to be like that in the dark. Rain started to fall again. The drops of rain hitting the tent sounded even louder than usual. The crawling sound continued towards us. It was right in front of the tent, and it was loud enough to know what it was. Roots still didn't bark, but remained at the ready. I readied myself and aimed the gas gun at the entrance of the tent. Then I heard a voice. I couldn't tell if it was male or female, but it sounded childlike, like the sound you make after clucking your tongue. I couldn't tell what it was trying to say, but the fact that something was trying to talk right in front of me almost drove me mad. I kept my gun aimed the entire time, and then Roots jumped for it. Its death throes filled the air, and worried about what might happen to Roots, I summoned up all my courage and ran outside. Roots had the thing we saw earlier in his mouth. I yanked his collar and told him to run. We made our way towards the manager's building. I was worried about whether Roots would actually follow me or not, but he did, and he barked once, as though in confirmation. I ran as fast as I could, lantern in one hand, gas gun in the other, and my nutter in my belt. There were no lights so as not to break the atmosphere in the campgrounds, so all I had to rely on was the lantern. The paths were maintained, but because they weren't made of concrete, they were soaked with rain. I was so scared I thought I was going to trip. I had no time to look down to see where I was going. I tripped on a tree root. I fell down a decline. It wasn't exactly a cliff, but there was still some height difference. My lantern and gas gun were still with me, but I hit my head, and everything looked dim. I could see roots barking at me from the path. I tried to get up, but I could barely move. For a moment, I thought that was it. It was all over. Roots continued barking, and before long my vision returned. I stood up and went to climb back up from where I'd fallen, but I could no longer hear Roots. Worried, I climbed as quickly as I could, and I found him growling and closing the distance on that thing from before. I took aim at its face and fired. It was only a survival game's air gun, so I knew it wouldn't do much, but I couldn't put Roots in any more danger. The thing cried out in a way that I can't even describe. Roots and I started running again. All I could think about was reaching the manager as quickly as possible. It was a fair distance to his building, but we ran in a daze. Finally, we reached it. The door was locked, but the lights were on, so I banged on the door as hard as I could. It felt like forever until he finally opened the door, but then he let Roots and I inside. I fell to the ground as he closed the door behind us. "Quickly, close the door!" I think I screamed as I did. He looked at us strangely as he locked the door. The manager asked me what was wrong, but I was breathing too hard to answer. He led me into the lounge, handed me a towel, then made coffee while I wiped myself down. We drank until I calmed. The manager also wiped Roots down for me. Thankfully, he didn't appear to be injured. When he was done, he sat in the chair opposite me and tried once again. "How are you? Calm down now?" He nodded as I told him what happened, and then I realized that his expression was stiffening more and more. When I was done, he stood up, went to a locker in the corner of the room, unlocked the padlock on it, and took out what looked like a hunting gun. "I'm going to check everything's locked," he said, and then left the room. He lived in a somewhat large bungalow, so I didn't think there could be that many rooms, but he ran around the house checking things. A short while later, he returned, and then he started throwing wood into the fireplace in the lounge. Once he was done with everything, he sat opposite me, his gun in hand, and a stern expression on his face. Then he started talking. To sum up, since long ago there had been a local kind of kami in these mountains. His family had owned the mountain for generations, so he had heard stories since he was a child. It looked pretty much exactly as I described it to him, and apparently it lived off wild deer. The manager had never seen the creature himself, but he had heard stories from guests who said they'd seen a monster that looked something like a slug. What shocked him this time is that from all the guests who had ever seen it, he'd never heard of it chasing or attacking any of them. He wasn't the type of person to believe in such things generally, but apparently what I'd seen was not normal. The manager, Roots, and I spent the rest of the night in the lounge. Around 2 a.m., the manager shook my shoulders and woke me up. Seemed that I'd fallen asleep at some point thanks to my exhaustion. That same voice was crying outside. Roots was at the ready by my feet. Neither the manager nor myself were brave enough to look outside. The two of us threw more wood on the fire so it wouldn't burn out. According to the manager, he'd never heard of the thing eating people before, but it had attacked people, so we couldn't let our guard down. Suddenly, I remembered the voice I'd heard back by the campsite. Itoshano. What had it said? I hadn't even mentioned that to the manager. I told him what I thought I heard, but he didn't understand it either. But, he said, it sounded like the Kanazawa dialect from Ishikawa Prefecture. I was born and raised in Kanazawa, but my parents were from different prefectures, so I had little experience with the local dialect. There were a lot of transfer kids at our school as well, so few people used it, and I couldn't really understand it. If anyone understands what that means, please let me know. The manager then heard the same voice as well, but he couldn't bear it any longer. The two of us moved towards the entrance and then peered outside through the window. It was still dark, of course, and we could definitely hear that crying voice coming from nearby. Then we suddenly heard a dull thud on the door, followed by another. Honestly, it kind of sounded like the earth itself was trembling. This rumbling sound on the wooden door, plus the rain and the baby cries mixed to make the strangest sounds. The manager aimed his gun at the door. I followed him and aimed my gas gun at the door too. Roots stood by my side, also at the ready. The manager's gun was the type with 2 barrels that opened like a hinge. Facing the door, his voice broke a little as he screamed, "Who is it? What do you want?" The crying and the banging and the rain all sounded so weird. Silence continued for about 3 minutes. We looked at each other, and I was just about to say, "It must be okay now," when suddenly something started furiously banging on the door. It was like it was throwing its whole body against it. The manager pulled the trigger. It was the first time I'd ever heard a real gun before. The sound pierced my ears, and the manager fell backwards. Several holes opened in the front door. We nervously opened it and looked outside. There was nothing there, but we found several hairs that looked like needles on the ground. The two of us covered the holes in the door with firewood and plywood, and then we waited out the rest of the night in the lounge by the fire. Morning finally arrived without anything more of note. I think it was probably the longest night of my life. The manager and I had been strained for so long that both of us were exhausted and ready to pass out. The manager called some of his friends from the hunting club or something. 2 hours later, 3 big old guys in their 50s and 60s arrived. The 5 of us and Roots went back to the campsite where my tent was set up. When we got there, those hairs that looked like needles lay all over the ground, and the stuff inside my tent was a mess. It might be better to say that everything had been crushed rather than broken. We returned to the manager's bungalow and told his hunting friends everything that had happened the night before. His hunting buddies agreed that it had to be the local kami. They had also never seen it before, but they had heard the stories since childhood. One of the old guys then gave me a lift home. This all happened yesterday, and now I'm back here. As for Roots, his mouth was a bit of a mess, so I took him to see the vet. Apparently he was in bad condition, so I had to leave him there. I'll head back again tomorrow to see him. As the old guy drove me home, he also mentioned that he'd heard stories of people seeing the creature, but never that it had attacked anyone. It apparently has various names, but you're better off not hearing them. Apparently just saying its name isn't very good for you. According to his story though, the creature was less of a kami and more of a mountain demon. There were all sorts of stories about its origins, and one of them was that it was a deformed child that had turned into a kami. At any rate, he dropped me off at home today, but he asked me for my number because they want me to go and get purified tomorrow. The vet asked me whether Roots had bitten a pincushion or something. His life's not in danger or anything, but apparently he can only eat like mushed up baby food right now. Without Roots here, I honestly feel helpless. But at any rate, I'm gonna head over to the hospital tomorrow to see him. Several days later. Let me tell you what happened on Tuesday and Wednesday. On Tuesday, I went to see the vet. He's going to keep roots for the rest of this week. I'll be able to pick him up on Monday. He was healthier than I thought, so I'm glad. On Wednesday, the manager and one of his buddies took me to visit a temple, and we spoke to the chief priest there. Here's what went down. At first, I thought a regular monk would come out and see us, but the guy had hair, like normal, and was young as well, only in his mid-30s. He led us to a waiting room or something they performed services in. There was a long desk in the middle. The three of us sat on one side while he sat on the other. I told him everything, start to finish, without concealing a thing. When I reached the part where I ran to the manager, he joined in as well. He had apparently already heard most of the story from the hunting guys, so he sat calmly and listened. He had heard similar accounts and legends from his predecessors, but apparently it was the first time anything like this had happened during his time, so he looked confused. When we were done, he spoke. The first story he told us was how deformed children would be reborn as kami, or Buddha, and they would be raised in the mountains. They targeted children who were missing limbs, or had too many or too few facial features. The second story was about a large caterpillar. People would present newborn babies to this massive caterpillar. That's the gist of it, anyway. The actual story was a lot more gross. Just hearing it made me feel sick. And the caterpillar might, in truth, actually be a slug. It's a famous legend that was passed down in the villages around there. The poster of this story mentioned the phrase "itoshano," which comes from the Kanazawa dialect. He doesn't speak it, so he doesn't know what it means. Replies to the thread from those who did mention that it means, "What a pity," or "How sad." Why the creature was muttering this is unknown. And that brings us to the end of this week's episode. I'd like to thank everyone for their support over the last few months, especially over at the Patreon. If you're looking for even more Kowabana, you can get over 100 bonus and exclusive stories right now by heading over to patreon.com/TaraADevlin. You can also find exclusive translations of old Japanese horror games, as well as internet mysteries, bizarre crimes and disappearances, and much more over at the Kowabana YouTube channel. You can find that at youtube.com/KowabanaJapan. Stay safe, everyone, and I'll see you again next time for even more Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Want even more scary stories? Head over to kowabana.net for new translations every week. You can also join our Patreon for exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. Head over to kowabana.net now.